The rain tapped softly against the hospital window, a quiet rhythm that had lulled Daniel Carter into a numb familiarity over the years. His wheelchair sat by the bed, its polished metal catching the dim light of the room. 20 years, 2 decades, since the accident that had stolen his legs, his independence, and, most painfully, his chance to say a proper goodbye to his mother. He hadn't visited her grave. Not once. The guilt was a stone in his chest, heavier than the paralysis. His mother's final words to him had been a plea. "Come see me, Danny. There's a letter. For you." But the crash happened before he could make that trip. And after? The thought of rolling up to her resting place, helpless in a chair instead of standing tall like the son she'd known, felt like a betrayal. So he stayed away, locking his grief behind a wall of silence. His 45th birthday arrived like any other day. No celebrations, no family, just the sterile hum of the medical facility he called home. But then Emily, his nurse and the closest thing he had to a friend, walked in holding something that made his breath catch. A yellowed envelope, brittle with age, his name scrawled across it in his mother's handwriting. "The lawyer finally gave it to me," Emily said gently, placing it in his lap. She left instructions. "Only when he's ready." Daniel's hands shook as he opened it. The words inside were a punch to his soul. "Danny, I know life may break you sometimes, but I raised a boy who had more strength than any man I ever met. If you fall, don't stay down. You'll know when it's time to come see me. And when you do, you'll find more than peace. You'll find yourself again." Tears blurred his vision. For the first time in years, the wall around. His heart cracked. "Take me to her," he whispered. Emily didn't hesitate. By sunrise, they were at the cemetery, the morning mist clinging to the grass as Daniel rolled toward the grave he'd avoided for so long. His throat tightened as he placed white roses beside the headstone, his fingers brushing the cold stone. "I'm sorry it took so long," he choked out, but what happened next would change everything. The cemetery was silent except for the distant chirping of sparrows and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Daniel's hands trembled as he clutched the letter, his mother's words still echoing in his mind like a ghost he could no longer ignore. The headstone before him was simple, unadorned, just her name, Margaret Carter, and the dates marking. A life cut too short. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed what he would say, how he would apologize for his absence, for his failure, for the years he had spent drowning in self-pity instead of honoring her memory. But now that he was here, the words evaporated, leaving only raw, aching regret. He lowered his head, tears dripping onto his motionless legs, and for the first time in 2 decades, he allowed himself to truly grieve. Behind him, Emily stood quietly, giving him space, her own eyes glistening. She had been with Daniel for 5 years, longer than any other nurse because she saw what others didn't. The man beneath the bitterness, the one who still cared deeply but had forgotten how to show it. She had read the letter before handing it to him, not out of nosiness, but because the lawyer had insisted she understand its weight. And now, watching Daniel's shoulders shake with silent sobs, she felt a surge of protectiveness. He had spent so long punishing himself, believing he didn't deserve forgiveness, but maybe today would change that. Then a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps, soft at first, then multiplying. Emily turned, her breath catching as she saw them. A small crowd of people approaching slowly, their faces solemn but kind. An elderly man in a worn military jacket stepped forward, his posture stiff with age, but his eyes sharp with recognition. Behind him, a woman with silver-streaked hair clutched a faded photograph to her chest, her lips trembling. Others followed, neighbors from Daniel's childhood, faces he might have recognized if he had ever looked back. But he didn't notice them at first, too lost in his own sorrow, until a weathered hand rested gently on his shoulder. Daniel flinched, lifting his tear-streaked face to see the old veteran staring down at him with an expression that held no judgment, only understanding. "She talked about you all the time," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Even in the worst of it, when we were stationed overseas and the nights felt endless, your mother would tell stories about her Danny, how brave you were, how you'd climb the tallest trees just to prove you could." Daniel's breath hitched. He hadn't thought about those days in years, the boy he used to be before the accident, before the world turned cold. The veteran squeezed his shoulder. "She never blamed you for not coming. She just wanted you to be happy." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd, and then, one by one, they began to share their own memories of Margaret, how she had volunteered at shelters, how she'd saved a neighbor's child from a house fire, how she'd smuggled letters for soldiers who couldn't send word home. Daniel listened, stunned, as strangers spoke of a woman far more extraordinary than the mother he remembered. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he had reduced her to a single moment. Her death, instead of celebrating her life. And then the crowd parted. A tall man in a long coat stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Daniel with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Dr. Bennett," Emily whispered, her voice tinged with awe. The man didn't acknowledge her. His attention was fixed solely on Daniel. "I knew your mother," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "She saved my life in more ways than one." He paused, studying Daniel's wheelchair, his expression unreadable. Then, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, he said, "And now, it's my turn to save yours." The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities as Dr. Bennett's words hung in the silence. Daniel stared up at him, his tear-blurred vision struggling to focus on the man's face. Sharp angles, graying temples, eyes that held the kind of quiet intensity he hadn't seen since his mother was alive. "Save mine," Daniel repeated, his voice rough from years of disuse, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Hope was a dangerous thing, one he had learned to bury deep, and yet here it was, clawing its way to the surface despite his resistance. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles whitening, as if bracing himself against the weight of what this stranger might say next. Dr. Bennett crouched beside him, bringing himself eye level, his coat brushing the dew-laden grass. "Your mother pulled me out of a collapsed field hospital 25 years ago," he said, his voice steady but threaded with something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or grief. Bullets flying, no regard for her own safety. She dragged 3 of us to cover before the second blast hit. He paused, his gaze flickering to the headstone before returning to Daniel. "I made her a promise that day. She asked for nothing, but I told her if there was ever anything she needed, anything at all, I'd move heaven and earth to make it happen." A bitter smile touched his lips. She laughed and said, "Save it for someone who really needs it." And then, years later, when she was sick, she called me. Just once. Daniel's breath caught. His mother had never mentioned this. She had carried so many secrets, so many stories he would never hear from her lips. "What did she ask for?" he whispered, though some part of him already knew. Dr. Bennett didn't blink. "She asked me to watch over you." The admission landed like a physical blow. Daniel's chest tightened, his lungs refusing to expand. All these years he had believed himself alone, abandoned, unworthy, and yet she had been looking out for him even from beyond the grave. The guilt twisted deeper, sharper, but beneath it, something else stirred, a fragile, flickering warmth. The doctor continued, his voice low and urgent. "I've spent the last decade researching nerve regeneration, experimental treatments, things medicine says are impossible. I've had breakthroughs, but the medical board won't greenlight human trials without the right candidate." His eyes locked onto Daniel's. "Someone with your specific injury, someone with everything to gain." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Someone she loved enough to call in a favor for." The world seemed to tilt. Daniel's mind raced, skepticism warring with longing, fear wrestling with a hope so bright it hurt. "You're saying you can fix me?" The question came out raw, stripped bare of pride. Dr. Bennett didn't promise miracles. "I'm saying there's a chance. Not a guarantee. It would be painful, risky. You'd be the first." He held Daniel's gaze. "But if it works, you could walk again." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining. The veteran from earlier gave a slow, approving nod, as if he'd expected this all along. But Daniel heard none of it. His pulse roared in his ears, his mother's letter burning against his thigh in his pocket. "You'll find yourself again." Was this what she meant? Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rang out, harsh, mocking. "Oh, come on, this is pathetic." All heads turned. A man in his 50s, his expensive suit at odds with the somber setting, pushed forward, his lip curled. Daniel's stomach dropped. Uncle Richard, his mother's brother, who hadn't bothered to visit him once in the hospital after the accident. Richard scoffed, glaring at Dr. Bennett. "You expect him to believe this fairy tale? Margaret's been dead 20 years, and you show up now with some miracle cure?" He turned to Daniel, his expression dripping with false pity. "Don't be a fool, Danny. They're preying on your grief. Next, he'll ask for money." A tense silence followed. Dr. Bennett didn't react, but Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "How dare you? You weren't there when he needed family. You don't get to—" "Emily," Daniel interrupted softly. He stared at his uncle, the man who had sold his childhood home out from under him while he was still rehabilitating, who had told him to accept reality when he'd dared to ask about college funds left in trust. The anger was old, familiar, but for the first time, it didn't consume him. Because Richard was wrong. This wasn't about money. This was about a mother's love. Daniel exhaled, his decision settling into his bones. He looked at Dr. Bennett and said the two words he never thought he'd utter, "I'm in." The days that followed were a blur of medical evaluations, consent forms, and the kind of tests that made Daniel's body feel like a specimen under glass. Dr. Bennett's facility was nothing like the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospitals Daniel had grown accustomed to. It was smaller, quieter, with walls lined with handwritten notes and diagrams that looked more like a mad scientist's sketches than approved medical research. Emily stayed by his side through every scan, every blood draw, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of what-ifs. But as the reality of the procedure loomed closer, Daniel found himself staring at the ceiling in the dead of night, his mind racing with a single terrifying question. What if it doesn't work? The morning of the first treatment, Dr. Bennett laid it out plainly. "We're going to inject a modified viral vector into your spinal column," he explained, his tone clinical but not unkind. "It's designed to target the damaged nerves and, if everything goes right, stimulate regeneration." He paused, then added, "You'll be awake for it. I need you to tell me what you feel, even if it's just pressure." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. He'd spent 20 years feeling nothing below his waist. The idea of sensation returning, even pain, was both exhilarating and horrifying. The procedure itself was worse than he'd imagined. The initial prick of the needle was nothing compared to the white-hot fire that spread through his spine moments later, as if someone had lit a fuse inside his body. He gasped, his fingers clawing at the edges of the examination table, sweat beading on his forehead. Emily's hand found his, her grip tight enough to bruise. "Look at me," she urged, her voice fierce. "Breathe, just breathe." He focused on her face, the freckles scattered across her nose, the way her eyebrows knit together when she was worried, and clung to it like a lifeline. Then, something impossible happened. A twitch. Faint, fleeting, but there, a flicker of movement in his right foot, so slight he might have imagined it. but Dr. Bennett's sharp inhale confirmed it. "Did you see that?" the doctor whispered, his usual composure shattered. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. For the first time in 2 decades, his body had responded. The room erupted in hushed excitement, but all Daniel could do was laugh, a broken, disbelieving sound that bordered on hysterical. "It's working," he choked out. Emily squeezed his hand again, her eyes bright with tears, but the high was short-lived. By nightfall, the fire in his nerves had dulled to a persistent ache, and the flicker of movement was gone. Dr. Bennett warned him this was normal. "Healing isn't linear," he said, but the loss of that fleeting hope was a crushing blow. Daniel lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the medical equipment, the cruel voice in his head whispering that he'd been a fool to believe, that his uncle was right, that some things couldn't be fixed. Then, a knock at the door. Emily stepped in, carrying a tattered shoebox. "I called your old neighbor," she said, setting it on his lap, "the one who kept an eye on your mom's things after the accident. She thought you might want these." Daniel lifted the lid with trembling hands. Inside were photos, him as a gap-toothed kid on a bike, his mother grinning behind a birthday cake, a family vacation to the coast he'd forgotten entirely, and at the bottom, a small velvet box. He opened it to find his father's pocket watch, the one he'd assumed was lost forever. His breath caught. "How?" "She kept things for you," Emily said softly. "Even when you pushed everyone away, she never stopped believing you'd come back." Daniel's vision blurred. He'd spent so long defining himself by what he'd lost, his legs, his independence, his mother, that he'd forgotten the boy in those photos. Stubborn, reckless, alive. The boy his mother had loved enough to save, even from beyond the grave. He wiped his eyes and looked at Emily. "Tell Dr. Bennett I'm ready for round 2. The weeks that followed were a brutal dance of hope and despair. Each treatment brought flashes of sensation, a tingling in his toes, the ghost of pressure against his knee, only to fade into frustrating numbness hours later. Dr. Bennett adjusted. Dosages, recalibrated equipment, and scribbled furious notes in his charts, but progress was agonizingly slow. Daniel's body became a battleground of tremors and muscle spasms, his sheets perpetually damp with sweat. The worst nights were when phantom pains struck, crippling cramps in limbs that hadn't moved in 20 years, leaving him gasping through, clenched teeth. Emily would appear like a shadow in the doorway, her hands cool against his feverish skin, whispering, "Breathe through it. You're okay," until the storm passed. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling physical therapy session, Daniel's arms gave out as he tried to lift himself onto the parallel bars. He crashed to the mat, his forehead striking the edge of a stool. Blood trickled into his eye as Emily rushed forward, but he shoved her away with a snarl. "Just stop! Stop pretending this is working!" His voice cracked like shattered glass. The room fell silent. Even Dr. Bennett paused in the doorway, his usual confidence wavering. Emily didn't flinch. She crouched beside him, her voice low and steady. "You want to quit? Fine. But look me in the eye and tell me that boy in the photos, the one who climbed trees just to prove he could, would walk away now." Daniel's chest heaved. The old shoebox of memories sat on the nearby bench, a black and white photo of his 8-year-old self peeking out, grinning atop a oak branch, his mother cheering below. That boy hadn't known the meaning of impossible. A tear cut through, the blood on his cheek. "I don't know how to be him anymore," he admitted hoarsely. Emily pressed a bandage to his forehead, her touch impossibly gentle. "Then stop trying. Be who you are now, the man who showed up at his mother's grave after 20 years. That's who she believed in." Something unclenched in Daniel's chest. The next morning, as dawn painted the walls gold, he felt it, a toe curling. Not a spasm, not a reflex. A deliberate, if shaky, movement. Dr. Bennett's coffee cup hit the floor, and then came the letter. It arrived in a nondescript envelope, postmarked from a military base overseas. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the opening line stole Daniel's breath. "If you're reading this, Margaret's son, then her faith in you was right until the end." The pages that followed revealed a truth Daniel's mother had never shared. Her work as a combat nurse hadn't ended when she left the service. She'd smuggled medical supplies into war zones under cover of darkness, saving hundreds. The letters. Author, a colonel who'd served with her, included a faded photograph of Margaret standing beside a makeshift hospital tent, her arms around 3 children. On the back, in her handwriting, "This is why I fight, so others get to keep living." Daniel's hands shook. All this time he'd thought his paralysis was the end of his story. But his mother had lived a lifetime of battles he'd never known, and she'd never once surrendered. That night, he dreamt of standing. When he woke, the sheets were tangled around legs that had twitched violently in his sleep. Dr. Bennett called it a neurological breakthrough. Emily called it a miracle. But Daniel, he called it a beginning. The air in the rehabilitation room was thick with tension as Daniel gripped the parallel bars, his knuckles bone-white from the strain. Dr. Bennett adjusted the harness strapped around. His torso, a safety measure, but one that felt like chains to Daniel. 3 months of treatments, of blood and sweat and tears, had led to this moment. His legs trembled violently beneath him, muscles screaming in protest after years of atrophy. The electrodes taped along his spine hummed faintly, sending targeted pulses to the damaged nerves. Dr. Bennett's last-ditch effort to bridge the gap between flickering hope and reality. "Remember," the doctor murmured, "this isn't about strength. It's about rewiring your brain to remember what your body already knows." Daniel gritted his teeth. Easier said than done. Every nerve ending felt like it was on fire. His spine, a live wire of agony. But then he caught Emily's gaze from across the room. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers laced together so tightly her wedding band dug into her skin. She'd stayed late every night for this, believed when no one else had. He couldn't let her down. With a guttural cry, Daniel pushed. For one impossible second, the world tilted. His thighs burned, his knees threatened to buckle, but he was standing. A choked sob escaped Emily. Dr. Bennett's pen clattered to the floor. Daniel's reflection in the mirror across the room was a stranger, a man upright for the first time in 20 years, swaying like a sapling in a storm, but standing. Tears blurred his vision as he locked eyes with his own reflection. Really looked at himself for the first time since the accident. The gaunt cheeks, the streaks of gray at his temples, the eyes that had long since lost their light. But in that moment, he saw her, his mother, in the stubborn set of his jaw, the defiance in his gaze. "Now," Dr. Bennett said softly, "try to shift your weight. One small step." Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. He willed his right leg forward, muscles quivering with the effort. The room held its breath. His foot slid an inch, then collapsed beneath him. The harness caught him before he hit the ground, but the failure was a knife to the gut. "Again!" Daniel snarled, even as his body shook with exhaustion. Dr. Bennett exchanged a glance with Emily. "Daniel," Emily started, but he cut her off. "I said again." They worked until his legs gave out completely, until he hung limp in the harness, sweat-drenched and trembling. Dr. Bennett helped lower him back into his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. "We'll try again tomorrow," was all he said before leaving the room. Emily knelt beside Daniel, her hand steady as she wiped his face with a cool cloth. He expected pity. Instead, she smirked. "You know, for a guy who couldn't move his toes 6 weeks ago, that was pretty damn impressive." Daniel blinked. Then, to his own shock, he laughed, a raw, real sound he hadn't made in years. "1 inch," he muttered. All that for 1 inch. Emily's smile faded into something softer. The longest journeys start with a single step, she said quietly, even if it's just an inch. The morning of the public demonstration dawned with a quiet tension that settled over the hospital like a thick fog. Daniel sat by the window in his room, staring at his reflection in the glass. The man who had spent 2 decades defined by a wheelchair, now on the verge of rewriting his own story. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over the braces strapped to his legs, the cold metal a stark contrast to the fire of determination burning in his chest. Today wasn't just about proving he could walk, it was about proving his mother had been right all along, that even in his darkest moments he had carried her strength inside him without realizing it. The letter from the colonel still lay open on his bedside table, its words etched into his mind. Margaret never saw lost causes, only people who hadn't found their way yet. The auditorium was packed when Daniel rolled in, a sea of faces turning toward him. Doctors in white coats, journalists with cameras poised, patients from the spinal ward watching with a mix of awe and desperate hope. And there, in the front row, sat Uncle Richard, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Daniel met his gaze for a brief, charged moment before Dr. Bennett stepped forward to address the crowd, explaining the science behind the treatment, the risks, the odds. But Daniel barely heard him. His focus was on the parallel bars set up on the stage, the 10 feet of space that might as well have been a marathon. Emily stood beside them, her usual calm replaced by a barely concealed nervous energy. She reached out as he approached, squeezing his shoulder. "No matter what happens out there," she whispered, "you've already won." Daniel transferred himself onto the edge of the stage, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the entire room could hear it. The braces clicked into place with a series of soft snaps, the electrodes along his spine humming to life. For a terrifying second, he froze. What if he failed? What if, after everything, his legs betrayed him in front of all these people? Then his eyes landed on a familiar face in the crowd, the old veteran from the cemetery, the one who'd spoken of his mother's. Courage. The man gave him a slow, deliberate nod, as if to say, "You're her son. Act like it." With a grunt, Daniel pushed himself upright. The gasp that rippled through the room was almost comical. He swayed, his arms shaking as he gripped the bars, but he didn't fall. Step by agonizing step he moved forward, his gait uneven, his breath ragged, but undeniably walking. Halfway down the bars, a searing pain shot up his spine and his knees buckled. Emily lurched forward, but Daniel threw out a hand to stop her. "No," he ground out through clenched teeth. "I've got this." And then, the impossible. He let go of the bars. The crowd erupted as he stood unsupported, his arms outstretched for balance, his face alight with something no one had seen in 20 years, pure, unfiltered joy. 2 steps. 3. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, he turned toward his uncle. Richard's face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. "You were wrong," Daniel said, his voice rough but clear. "About me. About her. About everything." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. But the real moment came afterward, when the crowd had dispersed and the cameras had stopped flashing. Daniel sat on the edge of the stage, exhausted but exhilarated, rolling the familiar weight of his father's pocket watch between his fingers. Emily joined him, her shoulder brushing his. "She'd be proud, you know," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Because finally, after 20 years of running from her memory, he understood. His mother hadn't left him a legacy of guilt. She'd left him a legacy of fight. And for the first time since the accident, Daniel Carter wasn't just living, he was alive.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.